I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here tonight. And I have the pleasure of welcoming you to our Mercedes-Benz Foreign Policy Forum with Evan Osnos entitled Wildland, the Making of America's Fury. The Mercedes-Benz Foreign Policy Forum is made possible by the support of the Mercedes-Benz Fonds im Stifterverband für die Deutsche Wissenschaft. And Evan, you are following in the footsteps of such distinguished speakers as Bill Burns, now the head of the CIA, architecture critic Michael Kimmelman, political scientist Lynn Vavreck, and many others. To our speaker, Evan Osnos is an American author and journalist. Since 2008, he has been on the staff of The New Yorker. He is now based in Washington, writes about foreign policy and politics more broadly. From 2008 to 2013, he was the China correspondent for The New Yorker. Now, when I heard that Evan might be available to come to the Academy, making the decision on this proposition was about the easiest one I have had to make here. And the reason is not just that as a former journalist, I'm a sucker for great long-form nonfiction. It's also that I had read the excerpt that Evan published in The New Yorker of Wildland, and not only did I find it extraordinary and even electrifying, but so did many of my friends and colleagues and acquaintances. And if I recall correctly, this came out in May of 2020. At a moment when we were all bewildered and gloomy because it was the early days of the pandemic. And I remember this article strikingly because it pierced the gloom with even more gloom. It also hit particularly hard because the excerpt itself was focused on a not-so-obscure town in Connecticut, which Evan had grown up in, Greenwich, Connecticut, which is precisely next door to the town I grew up in, Stamford. A very different kind of town, I hasten to underscore, but Greenwich had always loomed large in our consciousness, and having read the book, I now know that as a kid I used to go bike riding past Evan's house, probably when he was in an earlier grade than I was, slightly. The piece hit hard as well because it was about how the tradition of genteel, even paternalistic republicanism, as personified by George H.W. Bush, that is the first President Bush, and his father, Senator Prescott Bush, was being eclipsed by a new and much harder-edged conservatism that was characterized by an economic rapaciousness and by the seeds of what ultimately became Trumpism. I knew then that there was a great book coming, and I wasn't disappointed. And Wildland is a remarkable achievement. It's a tour of America that draws the connections between the actions of some of the nation's richest and most privileged people, as well as some of its worst off. That is, it ties them together in a way that I think few other books have. It belongs on a shelf with such books as George Packer's The Unwinding, Robert Putnam's Our Kids, and Matthew Desmond's Evicted. And I think it will make you gasp, and if you grew up in Stamford, Connecticut, at least, it might even make you cry. On October 31st, the German edition of Wildland will be published by Suhrkamp. I wanted to say Wildland, but I'm not going to say that. It's Mein wütendes Land, eine Reise durch die gespaltenen Staaten von Amerika. My Angry Country, a trip through the divided states of America. Just to fill in a little more about Evan's biography, before joining The New Yorker, he was the Beijing bureau chief for the Chicago Tribune, where he contributed to a series of articles that won the 2008 Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. Before going to China, he worked in the Middle East, reporting mostly from Iraq, and also, I guess, sometime in Chicago, right? Yeah. His first book was entitled Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth, and Faith in China. Based on 8 years of living in Beijing, the book traces the so-called rise of the individual in China and the struggle between aspiration and authoritarianism. It didn't do too badly. It won the National Book Award for Nonfiction in 2014, and it was a finalist for the 2015 Pulitzer Prize. Evan is also the author of a biography of someone who was running for president named Joe Biden, and it is entitled Joe Biden, The Life, the Run, and What Matters Now, and the book was an international bestseller. So let me just say I'm thrilled to have Evan here. I should note among his other achievements, he has a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old.
Yes, that's right.
The other person who is responsible for them has joined us here tonight, his wife, Sarah Beth. I'm delighted they're both here. Delighted, too, that the American Academy could afford them a short respite from the joys of child rearing. But anyway, Evan, it's a pleasure to have you. Before I give you the mic, let me just say we will be doing the usual thing. Everyone here who wants to ask a question during the Q&A that will follow Evan's talk, you know how to deal with that. If you are watching us on Zoom, please type your question into the Q&A part of the Zoom platform, not into the chat, which we won't be chatting with. And we apologize in advance if we can't answer all the questions. Evan, it's all yours.
Well, I have to say thank you to Dan for just an extraordinary introduction to the pride of Stamford, Connecticut. If they're watching tonight, they should be very proud. I have to say it is a great pleasure and an honor to be here at the Academy. I have had many friends who have been fellows here over the years, and if you mention the American Academy in Berlin, they get this moony look on their face. Like the mention of an old girlfriend or boyfriend from summer camp, and they say, the Academy. And now I begin to understand why. It is just a great honor to be here, and thanks for coming out to talk about a subject that is not always restful, but I hope might be illuminating. And that, of course, is the subject of American politics. That was quite a reveal with me reaching down and grabbing this, as if it was a rabbit out of a hat. I think as you heard from Dan's very thoughtful introduction, I've had this great good fortune to be in this business of my adult life spent wandering around the world with a pen and a notebook, talking to people about the lives that they're living and what they're going through. And I became a foreign correspondent now about 2 decades ago, and I was in Cairo and I was in Baghdad, and eventually I ended up in China for 8 years. And in all of these places, I often found myself in conversation with people who were, as I came to think of it, in the gears of history. Because of authoritarianism or war, they found themselves kind of pinched between these larger forces than themselves. And I often found myself in these moments making a case for the United States. I didn't do it on the page. That's not why I do this work. But almost just inevitably, as a human being, I found myself as an American talking to them about the United States. But I will say, before I get to that, the thing about this kind of work is that it's very intense. As you know, being a foreign correspondent is full of these moments that kind of test you, but there are also moments of surprise. I remember once I was being smuggled into Myanmar by a rebel militia in the middle of the night, which would have terrified me, except that the driver in the car spent the whole time asking me how he could get a date with Taylor Swift. And I mention this because inevitably the complexity of real lives, the eccentricity, the strangeness, the nuance of an individual life is always going to impress me more than whatever the abstractions are that I can put on the page about a place or a people. And my goal in my work ultimately is to try to reflect that strangeness, the eccentricity, the specificity of the people that I encounter in the gears of history. And so, as I mentioned, I often found myself making a case for the United States. I would say to people, look, I know we have made grave mistakes, especially in the last 2 decades, But we stand for some big ideas. And those big ideas include, for instance, a faith in the rule of law, a faith in the idea of truth, and a belief fundamentally in the idea that you can change your station in life. You can get from one place to another. And all of us can itemize the ways in which the United States has fallen short of that, but that is our fundamental idea, the thing that holds us together as a people. F. Scott Fitzgerald used to say that France is a land, England is a people, but America, he wrote, is a willingness of the heart. And on some level, it's this binding set of concepts that makes us a country. And in my case, after a decade abroad, it's time for us to come home. My wife, Sarah Beth, who you've heard is here tonight, I will tell you, has the distinction of having the insight. She said, if we stay too long overseas, we'll never be able to come home. We'll lose touch with the country. Now, actually, what she really said was, or maybe this is what I heard, was, if we stay too long overseas, you're going to get weird. And she was right about that. But she was also right about the idea that as a writer, there is something electric about that moment of coming home, about that moment of encounter with your own place. It gives you a way of seeing that you didn't have before you left. In the 1940s, there was a man named John Gunther, an American author, who was the bureau chief in Berlin, among many other places, for a newspaper called the Chicago Daily News. He covered Europe, the Pacific, and then finally he wanted to understand his own country, and he went back to the United States, and he started talking to people, just interviewing people. He would ask people a very simple concept. He would say, what do you believe in most? And he would write down what they said. And John Gunther received the following answers: work, children, Thomas Jefferson, God, the Golden Rule, the Pythagorean Theorem, a high tariff, a low tariff, better agricultural prices, happiness, good roads, and Santa Claus. But the most frequent response he got from his fellow Americans was, quote, the people if you give them an even break. I mention this because he wrote beautifully about the United States, but the most interesting fact to my mind was that he said he often felt like a man from Mars when he was traveling around his own country. And I have to tell you, that is precisely how it felt to me. Coming back to the U.S. in 2013, I felt very much like a man from Mars. And part of it was because of these little tiny changes that I sensed around me. I'll give you just an example of one. I noticed that Brooks Brothers, the suit maker, had started selling suits with a flag pin pre-attached to the lapel. And I called the company and I said, when did you start selling? Why and when? And they said, well, we do this because we want people to know things that are made in America. But I also noticed, which is interesting in and of itself, but I also noticed that they started doing it in 2008, which was the year that Barack Obama, then candidate, was being criticized for not wearing a lapel pin in his suit. But that, beyond the superficial details, there were also things that I noticed that were so vast that they were almost too difficult to fully absorb. Americans, for instance, had somehow come to tolerate the fact that there were mass public shootings in schools and in other places that were happening, and this is an easy fact to overlook, they were happening on average 3 times more often than they were when I had gone overseas. We had just absorbed this into our daily rhythms. The obscenity of that had somehow just become a fact of being American. And every time politicians would get up and they would give them a very similar kind of mantra. They would talk about thoughts and prayers. But efforts to pass any kind of real legislation always ran aground in Congress. So the effect of guns in some ways seemed to occupy too small a place in our public culture, from what I could tell. But then there were these other elements that seemed to occupy a larger place in our public culture than the statistics would suggest. The attacks of 9/11, for instance, had come to play a unique role, really, in our political conversation in the United States. In fact, it was playing tricks on our perceptions of ourselves. when researchers in 2016 went out and asked Americans to estimate the share of Muslims in the United States, people guessed, on average, 1 in 6. The real number is 1 in 100. But in our politics, this had become an ingredient to be played with, to be manipulated, and ultimately to be harvested. But frankly, the biggest surprise to me was around some of the very things that I had been talking about all those years overseas. America's faith in opportunity, our belief in the power of truth, and in the rule of law. And in each of these cases, I came home and found that these ideas were in crisis. They were in recession of a certain kind, that the notion of America's belief in social mobility had sunk. All the statistics showed that actually mobility itself had dropped to historic lows. We all know that now. Confidence in American institutions and authority were at sort of catastrophic lows. And the notion of a shared truth, what the former recidivist fellow, George Packer, has called a mental commons, was fracturing, really before our very eyes. And this was happening even before Donald Trump made his way to the Oval Office. Something profound was giving way. And it was happening with every Facebook post and with every simulation of fact that you saw on our airways. So the trend lines were very clear about something grave that was happening. And I, frankly, to be blunt about it, had begun to wonder if I had been lying to people all those years overseas about what the United States was fundamentally committed to, and I wondered whether I had been lying to myself about it. Were these actually not the animating ideas that were binding us as a people? And so I set out to answer that question. But before I talk about how I went about this process and what I came to believe, I want to mention just something about my comments this evening. Because I could devote our time tonight to documenting and describing and cataloging what is, by any definition, an American crisis of democracy right now. The number of Americans who believe lies about the 2020 election, which, just for the record, is now still north of 29% of Americans. Or I could talk about the number of candidates on the ballot who don't say that they will honor the results of the upcoming election. Or the number of Americans who talk about the prospect of civil war. We could spend this evening and more documenting that fact. But the purpose of tonight is not to admire the problem in that sense. We know it. Let's stipulate it. The question before us is to figure out, how did it happen? How did it get here? How did we get here? And ultimately, what might point us in another direction? So the questions that I'm really grappling with are deeper. They're about American political culture. Things like what eroded the beliefs and the systems that actually generate a sense of a common good in the United States, and what might rebuild them. And also, what are some of the habits of mind? I return a lot to the question of political culture, but what are the habits of mind that thrust us into the gears of history in our own way, and ultimately what might lead us out of it? To answer these kinds of questions, I decided to focus on these three places that I'd lived in my life. Because I said, if I drop into them, if I parachute into a new place in America, as I often do as a journalist, as we all do in this profession, I'll be able to get a snapshot of things, but I won't be able to get that harder question, which is what has changed? What was there before? What is not there now? And vice versa. So tonight, I want to just tell you about a few people, none of them famous, but all of them who are living lives that give an insight of a certain kind into what happened in America, and I think show us a bit of a surprising way, perhaps beyond the crisis that we're facing now. So when I set out to do this, I'd try to figure out what was sort of bubbling below the surface of the United States and American politics. I knew I was going to spend a lot of time in Chicago, which is, of course, where I went. I worked at the Chicago Tribune. My family had started out in Chicago many, many years ago. And it's also the great American city. It's, in many ways, it's the place, as Frederick Jackson Turner, the historian, once said, it's the place where all the forces of the nation intersect, for better or for worse. It's kind of a perfect laboratory for the study of America. And you see this very much in the present day that, for all of the talk about globalization and technology flattening boundaries, in Chicago today, there are neighborhoods that are more segregated today than they were when Martin Luther King marched against housing segregation in Chicago more than half a century ago. It is a place in which, and I found this myself, you can go into neighborhoods in the city, talk to social workers about children who have almost never been to the lake, which is right on the edge of the city and is the sort of emblem of small d democracy, a shared public space, public good, and these are kids who are marooned, in a sense, in the city because they don't have the money to move and it's because it's dangerous in a lot of cases to move around. I came to see them as shipwrecked, really, in the center of the city. And the difference between one neighborhood or another, for all that we talk about the porous boundaries of different parts of the American idea, the difference between one neighborhood or another, one zip code or another, is the difference of an entire life's trajectory. It's the difference between getting a tip on a job or getting a first-time loan or contracting COVID. The barriers are profound. And when I started talking to people about this phenomenon and I wanted to try to understand it, they said, you have to talk to a guy named Jamal Cole. So I met a guy named Jamal Cole. Jamal is a community organizer on the south side of Chicago, a description that is sort of evocative in its own way, if you're thinking about it in that way. He was 39 years old, and his parents didn't give him much to start with. He had grown up in a family without really much of anything. His father had been in the Navy, gotten out of the Navy, and had a drug problem. They had bounced from one motel to another. They had a very sort of unstable life growing up. And he was coming of age in a country that told him, statistically speaking, that he had almost no chance. It was a country, after all, that entered the 21st century with more people in prison than on farms. But Jamal is kind of wired a little bit differently. He's sort of allergic to the assumptions people have about him. And there was a guidance counselor at one point in a high school who said, I don't think you're cut out for college. I think you should basically try for the military. That's your best shot. And he tore out a page from the college guide, and he applied to some of the schools on the page, almost at random, and he got in. And he went to a small college called Wayne State College in Wayne, Nebraska. And it was a great blessing. He was thrust out of his environment into a new environment, and it just tweaked the way that he saw himself in the world. It gave him a chance to travel. It gave him a chance to meet kids who he wasn't otherwise going to meet. After graduation, he comes home to Chicago, and he has almost no more advantages than he had when he left. He didn't have a degree that was particularly helpful to him. He was doing odd jobs. He's got a job working for a guy at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, just as a day laborer one day, packing up some boxes and so on. But he's when you meet him, he's a guy who you want to know more. And they said, well, we want to find a way for this guy to get a job here. They found him a job in the IT department. He knew nothing about IT at all. But they sensed that he could do whatever it was that they asked of him. And they sent him to some training, and he got through the training and so on. And he felt very out of place there. As he said to me at one point, he said, everybody talked about hockey and sailing. It was all white, preppy, and kind of strange. But he stayed, and he thrived at this place. And before long, he was sort of beginning to look beyond the IT department. It wasn't all that thrilling for him. And he started to volunteer as a mentor at the Cook County Jail in Chicago, as a mentor to juvenile offenders. And he would spend time with kids who had a very rough road ahead of them. And one of the things that jumped out at them was when he asked them about themselves, he'd say, where are you from? And they'd say, well, I'm from 21st Street, or I'm from the neighborhood of Roseland, or I'm from this block. And he said, almost none of them said, I'm from Chicago. They didn't feel as if that was their identity. That was their sense. And he said, when he asked them why, they would say, because there are no black people downtown. Downtown Chicago is a bus ride from anywhere in the city, but it was in so many ways cut off from their sense of it being theirs. And Jamal's own biography was very eloquent in terms of expressing how transformative it could be to expose these kids to something other than what they knew. So he started an organization, community organization, with a very simple premise, which was to expose these kids to something that they wouldn't otherwise see. And he wanted to call it Changing Your Perspective, he said, but that would look stupid on a T-shirt, he said. So he called it My Block, My Hood, My City. And the idea began to take off. And he would set up these explorations, field trips, basically. He would take them anywhere that was an exposure. They'd go to a construction site. They'd go to a union hall. They'd go to a scuba diving class. They'd go to a chiropractor's office. Anywhere that was something else. His belief was simple, which was you can't be what you can't see. Get these kids out of neighborhoods that are carved up at a degree of segregation that is greater than it was 50 years ago, and maybe we'll begin to show them an alternative path. His focus was on a community that's known as the disconnected in Chicago. These are young people who are falling out of touch with the school system, with the job market. Chicago has one of the highest shares of young black men who are disconnected as any city in America. And as he started to do this, the more he did this, the more he embarked on a second kind of exploration, a second kind of field trip, which was that he started to take cops, police officers, white police officers in Chicago, and bring them on field trips to predominantly black neighborhoods. And the field trips were led by the kids in those neighborhoods. He was creating a moment of encounter that was not fraught. It was not actually in the midst of police work. It was creating a moment of awareness, just to be able to see one another in other terms. The kids would take them to where they like to go eat, take these cops. And for many of these cops, these are Chicago cops who'd grown up in the city, but for many of them, they'd never really set foot in the neighborhoods that they were about to be policing. They lived predominantly in white neighborhoods on the edges of the city, or they'd grown up in the suburbs. And this was not a grand strategic plan. This was a very simple idea, as he would say often, painfully simple. But he would take them around, the kids would take them around, and they'd say, this is where Dr. King lived when he was marching in Chicago, and this is my favorite restaurant, and so on and so on. All of it was what Jamal was intending, as he put it, it was to build the muscles of empathy. So last year, or 2 years ago now, when COVID hit Chicago, a lot of the neighborhoods that he focused on, the neighborhoods where he grew up, were some of the hardest hit with COVID because people had all of the pre-existing conditions that made them likely to be vulnerable, not just biologically, but also logistically. All of the testing sites, the vaccination sites, were farther from predominantly African-American neighborhoods on the south side and the west side. And one of the things he was able to do was to say, we're going to take these kids from these programs and we're going to put them into an internship in the hospital system, give them an exposure to what it's like to be working in the hospital, and the ones who thrive, they then are on a pathway to get on to something else. You saw another example of this. During the protests after the murder of George Floyd, you saw that some of these kids who were now protesting had actually met some of the police officers who were now on the other side of these protests. Nobody pretends this is a panacea, but it had created at least the basis for some recognition of the possibility of communication, getting people out of these worlds that were so rigidly apart. This work that he's doing was noticed, as you can imagine. Oprah Winfrey said, I'm going to pay some attention to it. She gave him money. Other people gave him money. He thought he was going to raise $1 million. He ended up raising $10 million in the course of a year, and off he is. Off he goes to the races. The whole point of what he was doing was giving some young kids in his city a sense that they deserve more of the common good than they assumed. But if you want to understand the origins of America's fury, you have to understand not just those who felt as if they were cut off from their share of the common good. You also have to understand some of the people who believed they deserved more of the common good than perhaps they did. And that brings me to a man named Jeffrey D. Grant. Jeff Grant, in the 1990s, was a lawyer in the suburbs of New York City, not too far from the place that Dan mentioned at the beginning. Very prosperous corner of America. Jeff Grant ran a law firm. He was on the school board. He was a part owner of a restaurant that was called The Good Life. which was an irony he came to regret. In his early 40s, he was doing very well. He kind of gloried in this capacity to consume. He and his wife and their kids used to go off on what they called shopping vacations, where they would be more or less buying what they could. They'd come back home, and sometimes they would go again on a shopping vacation, before they had even time to empty the bags from the previous venture. He specialized in real estate. He was a real estate lawyer in New York and in the suburbs. And he regarded himself, in his word, as an assassin. His whole philosophy, as he said, was win, win, win. His whole commitment, his whole creed was about ensuring that winners would keep winning. He moved to my hometown in the midst of his glories, Greenwich, Connecticut, home to the Bush family political dynasty, as you heard, home to a certain kind of captains of industry and finance of the 20th century. He was part of a moment in which it felt as if really the winners would always keep winning in a place like Greenwich. But by the time Jeff Grant got there, he was actually unraveling. He had become addicted to painkillers. He'd torn his Achilles tendon at one point and started taking Demerol, and then that led to OxyContin. And pretty soon he was kind of falling away from this treadmill. So he's starting to spend more and more of his time betting on stocks, on .com stocks at the time, and he was betting wrong. And he was beginning to lose money on some of these bets. And he started taking money. He passed a sort of barrier beyond which there's no return. He started taking money from the escrow accounts of his clients. And then after 9/11, it got worse, and he filled out an application for a loan from the government, a small business administration loan, in which he claimed to have lost the use of an office near Ground Zero, which was a lie. He had not lost use of an office near Ground Zero, but he got nearly $250,000, which he used to cover his debts and personal and office expenses. So when the IRS discovered what Jeff Grant had been doing, they came for him, a warrant was issued for his arrest, and he pleaded guilty ultimately to wire fraud, money laundering, and so on. And on Easter Sunday, he packed himself up from Greenwich, Connecticut, and reported at federal prison in Allenwood, Pennsylvania. And he served 14 months in prison. And he came home to Greenwich, and he had no idea what he was going to do next. He'd been disbarred. He had been more or less cut off from people he knew, his sort of friend circle. And this saved his life, probably, because he had undergone a kind of awakening of a certain kind, not one that I think he had ever asked for, but what Brian Stevenson, the great activist and lawyer, called the power of getting proximate, getting close to the suffering of people who are not like yourself. He had been pulled out of his environment and thrust into this sudden awareness of all of the advantages that he enjoyed and the ways in which he had helped to ensure that winners keep winning, rather than this deeper American notion, this belief we have about ourselves that we can get from one place to another if we try. And the truth is, prison had changed him. He got out of prison. He started working, found what work he could. He worked as the executive director of a social service organization, eventually got on the board, and eventually he went off to study religion. He went off to get a degree at divinity school in New York City at Union Theological Seminary. And what he started to understand through this whole process was that his problems did not begin with lying on a loan application, and it really didn't begin with getting addicted to Demerol. It began with something much deeper and more rotten that had been within himself, which is some ideas about what it takes to succeed in America and what is allowed. And if you can do it, you might as well. In a sense, there was this kind of flaw, a sort of cancerous flaw in how he thought about winning. The idea that you could win, 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 and enrich yourself at all costs. And of course, he wasn't alone in that belief. This was all happening in the context of these extraordinary corporate scandals that were happening in the United States at the time, in which you saw people breaking the rules in order to ensure that they could keep winning. Just to give you one memorable data point, if you retain one fact from this evening, let it be this. In 2001, after the accounting scandals at Enron and Arthur Andersen and everywhere else, CFO magazine had to abandon its annual Excellence Awards because winners from each of the previous 3 years had gone to prison. That, by the way, is the kind of story that I am telling in Wildland. It is that kind of fact that ultimately begins to explain how you get to now. There was a famous investor named John Bogle, who was one of the sort of pioneers of mutual funds. John Bogle, who later said, when I came into this field 6 decades ago, he said, the standard used to be there are some things that one simply doesn't do. He said, today the standard is if everyone else is doing it, I can do it too. And that sensibility is what Jeff Grant decided had to be the rest of his life's work. Attacking that idea, this sense of permission that it's okay if you're a winner to do what you need to do to keep winning. And he, as a minister and ultimately as a counselor, he created something that he calls ethics rehab, which is in effect a kind of boot camp for people who have committed white-collar crime. It's a story of a fascinating kind of its own, but he was diagnosing this absolutely sort of a fact that applies far beyond just his hometown and mine, which was this idea that we as Americans have to reconsider what winning really should mean in a modern American life. What does it really mean to prevail? But changing America's political culture does not mean just giving some people a greater sense of the common good or other people a slightly diminished sense of their piece of the common good. It also means changing how we think of ourselves as participants in this common project politically. And that leads me to the third person, the last person I want to tell you about tonight. Her name is Katie Lauer. So Katie Lauer is a Democratic Party activist in the state of West Virginia, which is a quixotic enterprise. If you know anything about the state of West Virginia, it's that being a Democratic Party organizer is a challenging assignment, to put it mildly. West Virginia happens to be a place I care a great deal about. I went there, my first job out of college. I worked at a little newspaper there. And back then, interestingly, in 1999, almost everybody was a Democrat. During the Great Depression, FDR had pushed aid up into the mountains and helped the people of West Virginia and had bought more or less a century of political devotion. It delivered John F. Kennedy the White House, and you saw it. People still, even when I moved there in the late 90s, people still had portraits of FDR that they would have hanging on the wall in places. It was a place where the labor union had thrived. There was a real attachment to the Democratic Party. But in the years since then, something profound had changed. It had undergone one of the most dramatic political transformations of any place in America. In the span of 2 decades, it had become thoroughly red territory. Trump territory, as we often say, in the sort of shorthand of politics, Trump country, as they say. And it was sort of forcing Democrats like Katie Lauer to say, is there anything we can do to begin to rebuild some possibility for the Democratic Party in rural parts of the United States? And that's how I met Katie Lauer. For a long time, she had been doing very sort of conventional activism. She was an environmental activist in West Virginia. They'd go out, they'd gather signatures to protest pollution and, a new coal-fired power plant or a new mine, and then they would bring it to the state government and it would get crushed because of the power of the mining industry, because of essentially the holes that had been pierced in this myth of the rule of law. That in Charleston, West Virginia, the capital of the state, the people who had power were not the people who mustered the most signatures and generated the most political will. It was the people who were in a position to dominate. And domination led to more domination. Winners kept winning. And she began to say, we're not getting anywhere with this. As soon as she would tell people that she was a Democrat, they would say, okay, you're on the other team, and they wouldn't hear a word she had to say. But she kept thinking about this very powerful piece of data, this one little piece of information that actually was a kind of superpowered piece of political code. That in 2016, in the 2016 election, before Donald Trump cruised to victory in that race, Bernie Sanders had won all 55 counties in the state of West Virginia in the Democratic primary. Somebody who could not be further afield from Donald Trump politically. So this place that we went around as journalists and casually described as Trump country had actually shown itself to be open to a socialist from Vermont. So a little bit like a militia member who's interested in Taylor Swift, something was a little more complicated than we assumed when we saw it at the most superficial level. And Katie Lauer recognized that. In fact, if you looked at a one-on-one poll of Bernie Sanders against Donald J. Trump, Bernie Sanders would have won the state of West Virginia. And today we wouldn't be talking about West Virginia as Trump country, it'd be known as Sanders country. And we'd be drawing all kinds of very different lessons about what's going on in America. The explanation for how you could get Bernie Sanders winning all 55 counties and then Trump winning is that this was a blaring siren, that Americans in places like West Virginia were utterly fed up with the way Washington functions and the way the two parties are functioning. And Katie understood that. She said, okay, people in West Virginia resent the way that, to be blunt, Democrats will say to them, as she put it, people in cities that have barely ever been to our state will come and tell us you're voting against your own interests, you're dumb, and inevitably there's going to be resentment about that. She said, neither party in the end has been curious about what people actually need to improve their lives. She said, there's no question the Democratic Party's policies are more advantageous to us, but they're not figuring out a way to talk to people in a way that they will listen to them. So Katie Lauer and others her age set out with this idea to try to get beyond the boundaries between red and blue in the most conventional sense. They recruited a broad set of candidates, mostly Democrats, but some independents, actually a Republican in there too. And they said, we're going to put a slate together, all up and down the ballot. City commissioners, tax collectors, dog catchers, you name it, everything up, including up to the governor's office. They had very liberal objectives, very clearly. They were going for things like single-payer health care, child tax credits, but they avoided the term progressive. They knew that if you use this kind of language, it was an instant end of the conversation in West Virginia. They didn't go in and ask people, are you voting for Trump or are you voting for Biden? They simply went in and talked about the issues that they were concerned about. And they pulled themselves together under a coalition that they called West Virginia Can't Wait. And they found their audience. They had hoped when they set out to do this that they might get about 20 or 25 people to run for office. In the end, they got 93. They had started attracting individual donations. They attracted 2,449 individual donations in West Virginia. The incumbent in the governor's race attracted 13 individual donations. In the 2020 election, as you know, Donald Trump once again won West Virginia. That was not a surprise. But the West Virginia Can't Wait movement ended up breaking all the records on small donations. They elected 11 candidates for office up and down the ballot. And within a week, they had another 18 candidates who wanted to run for office. Most of them first-time candidates who had never gotten involved in government, who wanted to do something, who wanted to run in the next election 2 years away. And Katie Lauer said something very interesting to me. She said, you know, after Trump lost, obviously we were thrilled. That's what we wanted. But she said, then I read a tweet online from a progressive activist, somebody who is just, well, more or less like me. We have a lot in common. And this person had tweeted, I hope that everyone at the Cracker Barrel is crying right now. The Cracker Barrel being the local diner. And Katie's thought was, why do we want anybody to be crying right now? Why is that the kind of winning that we think is going to advantage the United States in the future? She said one of the dimensions of the culture war is that we can and we should write places off, write people off. And she said as long as that's the case, we are going to get nowhere. And I think the most remarkable thing about what Katie Lauer is doing, the reason why I sort of linger on that story for a moment, is that they did the hardest thing, which is they figured out how to pick the lock of these identities that we have around ourselves in our American political culture. They figured out a way. It wasn't all that complicated. It was not. It was like Jamal Cole's field trips in Chicago. It was not rocket science. It was not the most brilliant stroke of political strategy. It was figuring out a new way to talk about politics that diffused some of these landmines that are lingering around us. In the last 2 minutes here, I want to just return to the question that got us started on this tonight, which was this question of whether I had been lying to people overseas all these years, and whether I'd been lying to myself about these values that are, in some sense, America's unfulfilled aspirations. When I started on this project, Sarah Beth and I had no kids. Tells you how long, unfortunately, it takes to write a book in our house. We now have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old. And along this process, because of that change in our house, I was kind of oscillating between these two sensations, these moments of total despair at our politics and these moments of kind of impossible joy at home. And I would go back and forth between these two things. And by the end of this process, I realized I was writing this book, in effect, for our kids, to explain this moment in American history when we, I think as a country, kind of drifted broadside to the judgment of our own moral history and found ourselves doing such violence to our own stated beliefs that I needed to be able to explain how it happened. How did we find ourselves here? What were the mistakes of mind that we made? And that ultimately would lead us, I hope, to be able to see again what it was that we aspire to. And so what I concluded on that question was that it was not a simple matter that we had never believed those ideas that I liked to imagine were so essential. But I really came to believe that those are not static commitments, and that it is not a matter of hope. It's not about us saying we need to hope we will do better. It is a matter of work, that we have to do the work, in effect, of self-renewal, of resilience, to build the muscles of empathy, as Jamal Cole puts it, to expose ourselves to these different communities, to step outside of our own advantages and to examine some of our assumptions about what it means to be winning in American life, as Jeff Grant did. And ultimately, I think to be willing, as Katie Lauer has done, to sort of put aside the political labels which we think are fortifying but are in fact quite enervating, and renounce this assumption that we have nothing in common and that there are Americans we can give up on. Because I think in the end that the prospects for reunification, which really is the word that a United States faces today, and I sort of use that word after some thought, that the prospects for reunification is not going to be a quiet process. It will be done out loud. And it will be raucous and I think kind of frightening along its way. I want to give the last words to Frederick Douglass, who called this process of renewal, of change, of progress, earnest struggle. And Douglass said in 1857, he said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters." Many waters indeed, and I welcome them. I think it's the path to our renewal. Thank you very much for listening. I'm very grateful and happy to answer your questions.
Well, God bless you for that. And thank you. But I'm color me puzzled because I've been reading your book.
That was your first mistake.
And, to say I want to slit my wrists might be overstating it a bit. But the book's pretty damn downbeat.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I kept saying I was waiting for a happy ending. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting. We talked at dinner and you mentioned your your feelings for George Packer,
Yeah.
who was here last spring, and there is a parallel in your works in that he finds a number of people, not necessarily contemporary ones, who embody the spirit that he sees as being required for renewal. But in his talk here, the note he ended on was pretty downbeat.
Yeah.
You seem optimistic. How optimistic are you really?
I can hold two ideas in my head at the same time.
Well, that's the sign of genius. I think that's
of coping.
That's what Keats said, right? Yeah.
I think a word first on George, who is, in many ways, I think of my book as a kind of unsolicited sequel to The Unwinding, because he wrote this brilliant book that ended in 2012. And as you can guess, if you haven't read it, it was a diagnosis of an unraveling in American culture and politics. And then the story ended. And then I moved back to the United States the next year. And I said, well, now what? Now we have to write about what's happened since then. And in effect, this is the story of what happened afterwards. And you're absolutely right. This book is a record of a catastrophe in slow motion. And I really came to think of its closest analogy as something like the 9/11 Commission report, which was a story of the preamble of a disaster. What were the failures of imagination? What were the things that we only came to recognize after the fact that led to it? And the truth is that the book ends, as you know, more or less on January 6th, shortly thereafter, which I covered as a journalist standing at the foot of the Capitol with this very strange sensation that actually everything I'd been writing about. I was on book leave when it happened, and they asked me to come and cover the event. And it was almost like this event was like the confluence, the conflagration at the end of this inferno this process I'd been describing on the page. The reason why I say I can hold two thoughts in my head at the same time was that is not the end of the story, in the same way that The Unwinding was not the end of the story. That what I've come to believe very deeply is that the phenomena that I talked about tonight, the kinds of ideas, the kinds of refusals to accept the status quo, the belief that things that once unexamined are worth calling out and saying are wrong, are in fact the first signs of a process of renewal. Because when I started on this project, now 7 years ago, if I went to Greenwich and I said, hey, I think that actually we have a catastrophic misunderstanding of winning, that was considered an idea. And I talked about, if I said I think that inequality is blaring 5-alarm fire right now, that was considered so far outside of normal political conversation that you couldn't get anywhere. Today, that conversation is still unwelcome in many parts of the country, but it is a fact. It is a permanent feature of our conversation. In the United States today, we are constantly talking, as you know, about the crisis of democracy. We were not talking about it 4 or 5 years ago, even after Trump was elected. And I think the fact that we are is a distinctly encouraging fact.
So I certainly share the belief that, recognition is the first step to self-knowledge and ultimately overcoming your problems. But the book you wrote has also an awful lot about the economic and political pathologies that led to these things. And I'm going to push you to depress us a little, because you can never have enough of that, and move beyond, some obviously heroic people, and their stories are really moving, and talk about the kinds of things that you think are needed at a more macro level.
Sure.
I mean, in your discussion of what has happened in your hometown as a result of changes in securities law, for example, things like that, I look at those and I say the analysis is right, and these are the things that led to the 2007, 8, 9 financial crisis. I have a hard time believing that we're really fixing our economic house in a significant way. So I'm going to just serve you that softball, and you tell us the big things that you think need to be done.
Well, first I'll tell you that I agree with you. I don't think that if you go to places that are on the winning side of the ledger in the United States and you say to them today, what would you like to undertake in order to provide a more equitable, honest distribution of wealth in this country? You're not going to get a lot of compliant, enthusiastic answers.
It's the beginning of a thoughtful conversation, I'm sure, yeah.
But what's fascinating is that you will find somebody like Ray Dalio, who is the head of one of the largest private equity funds in the United States, lives in Greenwich, Connecticut, who now says, okay, I've come to recognize income inequality as a 5-alarm fire. Now, his diagnosis for how you solve it is quite different from AOC's diagnosis for how you solve it. Right. But the fact that he actually has come to recognize that this is not a problem you can deny and will away and wall yourself off of intellectually is a sign that political culture, what we're talking about is ideas bleeding into the groundwater of American politics and forcing change. You know, I am a firm believer that before the point at which people in polite conversation like us begin to recognize that profound changes are necessary, that idea has begun to filter through the population in places as distinct and diverse as the south side of Chicago and Clarksburg, West Virginia. So, you know, in a place like Clarksburg, West Virginia, the short-term solution people had for their rage against politics was to pull the lever for Donald Trump. But one could just as easily imagine a scenario in which somebody else comes along to them and says, I have another idea for you. My name is Bernie Sanders, and here's a solution. It's called the provision of reasonable health care for every person in America. It's the idea that we're going to give you advantages to get you out of this town, whether it's by recognizing the dignity of vocation and vocational training, or by making changes to labor law that allow unions to once again provide a visible, sustainable improvement in your working life. These are the kinds of technocratic fixes that are actually not controversial once you separate them from the political label attached to them. And we're at this weird moment right now in our politics where it's both completely tribal and you've got some primordial soup. You've got people on the right, clever, cynical, opportunistic figures, people like Josh Hawley, people like Marco Rubio. As you can tell, not a huge fan of these guys, but they are one thing which is extremely alert to what's going to keep them in office. And you hear them striking populist economic messages in ways that they wouldn't have when they were simply hymning, sort of reading from the hymnal of the Reagan years, and it was all about trickle down and all about this kind of antiquated political ideology. We are at a moment of transition, and the technical fixes are available. They're not. This is not a mystery. I tend to look at the deeper fixes. I tend to look at things like creating some sense of a shared political project. I'll tell you the most I've written a lot over the last couple of years about Build Back Better, about all of the investments in infrastructure, all of the changes to the voting system, all of the ways in which we're trying to ensure that people actually have access to the ballot. The thing that I get most excited about is something that hasn't passed, but I think might yet, which is the idea of a grand national service project. The idea that if you take something that puts Americans from Clarksburg, from the south side of Chicago, from Greenwich, Connecticut, kids who are coming out of school, you put them side by side in some shared initiative. There's actually a proposal that was in government called the Climate Corps that was in the Build Back Better bill that would have been the largest expansion of public service, national service, voluntary service, since FDR sent people up into the mountains of West Virginia. It didn't survive, but it had backers on the right, it had backers on the left, and you may hear more of that. And for my money, that's one of the things that I think addresses a deeper sense of solution than what are necessary technical solutions at the moment.
Well, you know, from your lips to Joe Biden's pen, I would say, and I hope you're right. But I want to pick up on something you just said, where you mentioned that a lot of the ideas, if I understood correctly, are unobjectionable to those West Virginia voters once you divorce them from the culture wars and the identity conflicts and so on and so forth. The issue, perhaps, is not so much finding majorities who want to support things that would make the United States a more equitable place, a place where people could, in fact, have social mobility again, and where they felt that government was serving them. I think the problem has been, or certainly one of the problems, is that powerful financial interests, industrial interests, have a great way of intervening between those popular wishes and the acts of legislatures and the acts of executives. How are you going to fix that?
Well, as you know from the book, I spend a great deal of time talking about precisely this problem.
Right.
The fact that if you go into a state like West Virginia, if you go to a state like West Virginia, that people will say, why is it that we actually don't have drinkable water? And the answer is, of course, because the coal industry has what I consider that sort of the tools of political technology at their disposal. Lobbying, propaganda, they have all of the ways of affecting the situation, affecting politics to prevent popular ideas from becoming reality. Some of the things that actually do have a profound effect on politics, campaign finance reform. If I was going to be God for a day and you could actually get money out of politics, I mean, we'll add this to the list of from our lips to God's ears, but there is no viable path at the moment for a transformative change to campaign finance, partly because the Republican Party has wedded itself completely to the idea of unbounded money in politics. So short of a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, I don't see that happening. But that's the biggest obstacle. Another change, of course, is gerrymandering. I'll give you an example. When I moved to Washington, Congress was 82% white, 83% male, and 50% millionaires. That's not a reflection of the United States of America. And part of the reason is not just because of money in politics, those are the people who can win and win again, but also because the system is then predisposed to ensure that winners keep winning. The reason why I talk about these thematic expressions of technical problems is because if you focus on the technical impossibility of these things, nobody right now is passing a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United or get rid of gerrymandering. But if we begin to examine the reasons why those are unchallenged ideas, then I think you begin to move the pieces. If you make people say, well, why is it, in fact, that gerrymandering is considered to be okay, not just for Republicans, but for Democrats? Why is this okay? Then you can begin to change the assumptions. So from my perspective, I actually think that a lot of the technical solutions are rattling around in Washington, and you get increasingly a generation of incoming lawmakers who are of a generation who are challenging basic beliefs. Whether you agree with on everything or not, they really do see a fundamental change at work on income inequality, on gerrymandering. But in order to make those broadly possible, I think you have to begin to put the ideas in play.
So one last question. We'll open it up to the audience. It will be a step backwards if we suddenly have a large number of Republican secretaries of state who don't really want to certify election results in 2023. Wouldn't you agree that, in fact, I'm thrilled you're so optimistic.
I wouldn't go quite that far.
I'm a little worried that the realities are pretty tough, and we have a number of people here in the audience who may challenge you on some of these things, including fellows of the American Academy, I might add. But it's great you're optimistic. I'd like to be optimistic, but don't you feel like the sword is a little closer over our heads than?
I do feel as if I'm sort of arguing against somebody that's not entirely. I mean, the honest answer is, I get up every day. Part of my job is I write about politics. I talk about it on TV, and I get up and I'm the one who's saying, here's the number of people on the ballot who don't recognize the 2020 election. Here's the number of people who fundamentally challenge the basic notion of democracy, which is the consent of the loser. As I said at the outset of tonight, for me to get up and catalog those problems is probably to people who've already chosen to come to an event of this kind is telling people who have already come here things they already know. And I'm happy to go through it chapter and verse because it's my job. But actually, I find it at this point that the real challenge is to try to say, well, what is it that's happening? What are the pilot lights that can be sustained, that can be energized? What are the things that are not out of reach? I returned over and over again to things that are not rocket science. Because part of it is that we have said, as you did a couple of times, well, that's never going to happen. And that's never going to happen. But if that's the assumption, then there's no chapter at the end of the book.
Okay, I'm the bad guy. All right.
Well, it's better than being an optimist. It's better than being an optimist.
I've spent the whole life, expecting the worst. So, on that note, let us open up. We do not have any questions yet from our audience at home. So who has something? I see a hand all the way in the back.
Hi, Anya Brogan. I'm a German-American citizen. Grew up in Green Bay, Wisconsin. My mother's from Hamburg. I grew up in a fifth-generation Wisconsin Democrat family. My grandfather was one of the first 50 names on McCarthy's blacklist. So the political addiction runs genetically strong. Right. So I've been living in Berlin for over 15 years. So a lot of my German friends say, how did this happen? Explain this to us. And the best solution I have been able to come to is the breakdown of the American education system, starting in the 70s, progressing on. Also, the divestment of large factories and industry to other countries, thereby splitting a society where, middle-class, wealthy parents send their kids to private schools or homeschool them.
Right.
And lower middle class and working class families send their kids to public school. And when my father was growing up, everybody went to public school. And the banker's kid and the worker's kid, they all went to the same school. They all went to the same PTA meetings. This was the melting pot, especially in small communities. And now more and more, so that I see that this Spaltung, this scissors, starts at kindergarten. And that the rich kids and the poor kids are already split at such a young age. And that there's no possibility of any sort of if I'm wrong, let me know.
Absolutely right. And actually, so one of the metaphors that I use in the book to capture this phenomenon, this scissoring, I like that. It's I think of it as a segregation of the mind, and it starts even before they get to kindergarten. It's when their parents are choosing where to live and how to live and who to circulate among. That, this is partly about racism and it's partly about income inequality. But the degree to which we have become more and more encamped in our separate worlds, the way that I come to see it in the expression in the book is in the fortress making. So in Greenwich, Connecticut, the town that I described, there is this phenomenon of the building of the walls. There used to be, going back, to the Puritans, this old tradition of these little low stone walls. Robert Frost wrote about them as these kinds of symbols of what Tocqueville called self-interested, rightly understood. So there was a separate space, but you met at this small wall, and you had shared interests, you had shared projects. And over time, partly because of the financialization of the economy, and it's in the three themes that I return to over and over again. It's financialization, segregation, and nationalization of our politics. These three things, the financialization put so much money into the hands of so few that they began to build quite literally physical expressions of the fortress of the mind. In Greenwich, they began to build these tall stone walls that were mortared in place. And in fact, at one point, the head of a hedge fund in town later became famous because his fund was found criminally liable by the federal government for insider trading. He asked for an exemption to build the tallest wall of all, more than 9 feet tall. His name was Stephen Cohen. And when I saw these walls, and they became known, by the way, to the stonemasons in the area as Greenwich walls. They had emanated from town like a kind of virus. And they became reflections of a certain idea. And there is a way in which you can draw the patrimony of that idea not only back to Ronald Reagan, but all the way back to Barry Goldwater, and probably back to the reaction to the counterculture that began in the 1960s. And that ultimately leads to this segregation of our students from one another, because the rich kids are sent to the wealthy private schools. Well, you and I, that's where we get our street cred, you know? But that's the way. I actually say that by the time they get to school, the segregation of the mind has already happened. And it's an expression of the problem rather than, in fact, the problem itself.
And I strongly recommend you have a look at Bob Putnam's book, Our Kids, which lays this all out in devastating detail. And, you know, tremendous amount of what you say is exactly right on the point. I had Ambassador Ruga. Where did he? He's right there. He's hiding. Okay.
Thanks, Boris Ruga, Munich Security Conference. Thanks a lot for the great presentation. I'm interested in the question of whether some of the people who deny the legitimacy of Joe Biden's election and challenge, election results, whether some of them think ahead to the next election and the election after that, and imagine a scenario where they are presumably elected and their election is challenged. I mean, you can't do this forever, right? If you sort of if you insist on this, then you end up deconstructing the system. Is that? I'm sure there's plenty of people who are quite willing to ignore the consequences of what they're doing here, who are opportunistic. But are there some people among Republican election deniers who understand that they're playing with fire and that perhaps there has to be some kind of recalibration?
I would part the group into a few different ways of thinking. I think that there are rank and file, regular old Republican enthusiasts in places like Arizona who are in the grip of a total delusion. They believe, almost on a level of religious fervor, that the United States is imperiled by some form of conspiratorial craziness and that they are in a fight to save it from its final destruction. So they are that's one view. Then there are a group that worries me even more, and they are the members of Republican leadership in Washington and in state capitals who are playing a kind of vicious game, a power seizure, a power grab, a semi-fascistic game, to use a certain term. And I think to them, what they're doing, and this is my most generous reading, would be that what they are doing is a failure of catastrophic imagination, that they don't believe that what they're doing ultimately will matter very much. There is one of the things that explains kind of the dysfunction of British politics is the idea that all of it became a game. It's all a game. For Boris Johnson, it was all a game. And there's a degree to which there is a huge gene of that in Washington, particularly among what I think of as the kind of, particularly privileged Republican young elite, the Josh Hawleys of the world, the Marco Rubies of the world. They don't believe that it matters all that much. Ted Cruz would get up there and say whatever the heck he thinks he has to say in order to use Jeff Grant's formulation, to win. He'll worry about the next election next time. What he needs to do now is win. Because I think on some level, they recognize that the force of history is against them. Demographics are against them. Their policies are profoundly unattractive. This is the reason why they can't formulate a public platform. Think about that. The Republican Party has no platform because they know that the issues on which they are running are absolutely unelectable. And for that reason, they run in this language of essentially fascistic populist mobilization. And so I think you're giving them too much credit to think they've even thought about round two. They're just trying to dominate round one. That's my optimistic reading.
I'm so glad you're coming around. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, but what about the Democratic Party? We watched the situation with Bernie 2 elections in a row. Mm-hmm. We saw the DNC just squash him as much as they could. And here's the trick. Yeah, he was pretty old. We've seen that now again. We've had some old presidents lately. What's important about the Sanders phenomenon is not that he was too old. It's because they didn't like his policies.
I agree.
So what are we to expect of the Democratic Party that doesn't want to go there where it needs to go? And understanding about the woman whose portrait you showed us, the word progressivism is a red flag. That doesn't mean that progressive ideas are, but it does mean the word is.
Yep.
And if you get, as I do, every day 4 or 5 bids for money from the Democratic Party because I gave Bernie $27 a bunch of times, I can't get them off of my back. But here's the trick. What they have to say is pathetic.
Yeah.
All they do is do this funny football game between how the Republicans do and how they do. There are no issues.
Yeah.
I don't know what is to be hoped for. Okay.
Well, to be hoped for, I actually would think about that woman I mentioned before, Katie Lauer. She is a Democrat through and through. She is a progressive to the bone. And she is also thinking 2 steps ahead to say, if I want to get this done, I can't go out and call myself a progressive Democrat in West Virginia. I'm going to run into a hole in the ground. So I have to start to think about how I actually package this politics, which gets you to a kind of a counterintuitive conclusion, which is that the party as an organization is what parties are, which is actually pretty good at figuring out what are the ideas that are filtering up, how do we get them through a system that fashions some version of an electable idea, maybe in the form of a person. We nominate that person and we put them forward. And the reality is that as much as what a lot of us in this room, frankly, would agree are necessary solutions that are progressive in nature, that's actually not where most of the Democratic Party is. The Republican Party's image of the Democratic Party is further to the left of where the real Democratic Party is. Of the 18 candidates on the stage in 2020, the one who was elected president of the United States was the most conservative of the bunch, Joe Biden. Partly that's name recognition. Partly, though, it's because Americans have been slower to embrace ideas like single payer, like college forgiveness on loans. These kinds of things are slower to get into the mainstream, but they are getting there. Slowly, but they are getting there. I think the Democratic Party, if they move too far to the left in the near term, will probably lose more races. They tried things to get them done in the first 2 years of the Biden administration. This administration was pretty serious. Ron Klain, Chief of Staff, and the President of the United States were pretty serious about trying to achieve Democratic progressive objectives. You saw that on spending priorities, you saw that on voting rights, and they failed because of Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. The Democratic Party is riven, unfortunately, in ways that are maddening to us, but it's the reality. They have these 2 people. And as long as you have these 2 people, and those 2 people are a reflection of this broader canvas of the Democratic Party, you are probably going to end up with somebody like Joe Biden, who is a moderate with, I would say he's a moderate with alert political antenna that makes him open to progressive ideas because he sees where the future of the party and the country is going. That's probably their formula in the near term.
Ambassador Corn, we'll come back over here. Finally, a question from this side.
Well, I don't disagree with the word you said, except I think your perspective might be a little bit too short structured. There is another, perhaps overly simple way of talking about that, and that is the collapse of majorities. When the Great Depression came, when Franklin Roosevelt became president, the Republicans had more or less been in power for 50 years. When Newt Gingrich was elected Speaker of the House, the Democrats had been in power for 50 years, with a few back and forth. Eisenhower was not a Republican. He was a public servant. He was a bureaucrat, if I may say so. He was not a Republican. And so the Democrats really controlled everything for 50 years. And it was and the fact is, of course, the New Deal didn't really get us out of the Depression. It was World War II that got us out of the Depression. So they hadn't been, and they had the Dixie Crack Challenge, et cetera, et cetera. It's very complicated. So I'm all in favor of your analysis, and I hope everybody takes it to heart. But there are bigger forces at play here. And the Democrats just ran out of juice. Really, they really did. I mean, when Hillary Clinton... I sent off, I don't know how many emails the day that Hillary Clinton called the Republicans the deplorables. Mm-hmm. That was the most outrageous, tactically stupid thing that anybody could ever say. Yeah. But that was the mood of the Democratic Party in those years. Mm-hmm. In the 1920s, you know what the Republicans were like in the 1920s. The word plutocrat was coined for them. So again, your analysis is brilliant. It's been a great pleasure listening to you. But I think we have to be realistic about the fact that after 50 years of more or less progressive government, it sort of caught up with them. And now we're going to probably, I hope it's not 50 years, but we're in a phase where the principles of progressive government are doubted by large numbers of Americans for reasons that maybe people like us can't really understand. But it is the case.
Can I add one thing on that? Everything you said I agree with. I would add one other thing, which is that if you take the experience of the Democratic Party in a town like Clarksburg, West Virginia, it's kind of fascinating to observe the following fact, which is that in the 1960 presidential race, which people will remember, West Virginia was very important in that race. It proved that Democrats around the country would vote for a Catholic. Before West Virginia cast its votes in the primary, it wasn't clear that JFK was a possibility. It was assumed that he would probably be rejected by the system. But the Democrats poured a tremendous amount of energy, and in the little town of Clarksburg, West Virginia, population 13,000, JFK came to town, Bobby Kennedy came to town, Teddy Kennedy came to town, Jackie came to town. JFK went on local television and answered questions for 30 minutes from the people of Clarksburg and the surrounding area. And I know the people at the Historical Society, and I said, so since that big race when everybody came to town, everybody can remember those visits, I said, which other Democratic presidential candidates have come to town? And they said, well, I think Jesse Jackson came once in '88, passing through. There was a degree to which the Democratic Party began to focus elsewhere, and they, in a sense, the Republicans exploited the opportunity. They saw what they could do, and they turned it. And that, for me, is a reminder that people are paying attention if people turn away from the party.
Right here. Oh my goodness, we have so many questions over the time.
I'm not American. I'm German. But I'm interested in your country, of course, and that's why I'm here. You mentioned gerrymandering. As far as I know, America is the only country that practices gerrymandering. I know gerrymandering from the Irish history. I think it was invented there. And from listening to you and to all the others who participated in this discussion, I think one of the greatest problems is that you have this voting system that you have only two parties. You see it in the United States, and you see it in Great Britain as well. Yeah. And for Germans, it's I'm so happy that we have a coalition. You all know that is a very problematic coalition, but anyway, it works. Yeah. They have to find compromise, whatever. But in America, to me, it seems to be a standstill because everything that one party has decided to do is stopped by the other party as soon as they start governing. And this means, and you also said that so many millionaires, so money plays such a great role. And is there any hope of change?
I think you've identified actually an essential point, which has sort of been, I kind of assumed it but didn't announce it, which is that, and this gets to the earlier question, that the problem, essentially what we're witnessing is party death, but being unallowed to die. The parties, in any rational political system, parties come and go. And for a long period in American history, parties came and went. Remember the Whigs? There was a time when you had a much larger selection of parties, and there is a natural life to a party majority. And it has its moment, it has its energy, it has its personalities, and then it moves on. But the American system, because of all of this kind of legacy political technology, call it, which is essentially lobbying created law, and law that is created to ensure that people in office can remain in office, which consists of gerrymandering, campaign finance, all of these technologies, all of this is designed to prevent the introduction of new forces, aka a new party. Right now, the restraints against the new party are profound. I mean, to go to the earlier theme, that is actually one that is not going to happen at the moment. The best indication of that is that Michael Bloomberg, who, as you remember, tried to run for president a couple of years ago, was in the greatest position of anybody in arguably modern American history in terms of his money to be able to come up with whatever solution was going to be possible. Running as an independent, running as a new party, something. And what he concluded was they ran every kind of model they could, and they concluded that it was simply impossible, that state laws right now and the restrictions against getting on the ballot are so profound that it's too hard to come outside the system. And so as a result, we're bound in these two systems, and so I think the insurgency, the necessary insurgency, is most likely to come from within the party. It's somebody who calls themselves a Democrat, like Bernie Sanders. He operated within the label of the Democratic Party, but was operating as something other than a Democrat, and was immensely popular. Not popular enough, but immensely popular.
We are about out of time, but I want to get our last two questions. I'm going to have them ask their questions one after the other. Then you can answer them, and then we'll come to a close. Arabella. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for a fascinating talk. I want to ask you to expand a bit more on a concept you alluded to at the beginning, which was the mental commons. You referred as a quote.
Yeah.
And I, unfortunately, in my life, consider the ability to hold two competing ideas in my head as a sign of exhaustion, not genius. I run out of steam. But I feel you gave us both hope and despair in terms of your representation of how ideas are coming in to places that they could not enter before. There are ideas coming over those 9-foot walls, and there are words being uttered by people to whom they were antithetical. I would say that's the truth, but it competes with the truth that there are ideas that were extreme even only a decade ago that are now in the mainstream. Ideas that are not based on truths or facts or statistics, but that, as you say, rely on impressions and intuitions and political manipulation. You're 1 in 6 versus 1 in 100.
Yeah.
So, yes, important ideas are leaping 9-foot walls, but also extraordinarily unfactual ideas are entering into mainstream discourse, and there's no challenge, not enough challenge to them. They are being allowed to survive. They're not being tested. So what that made me reflect on in this conversation is we've spoken about the executive, we've spoken about the legislative, we've spoken about the processes, what the art of the possible is. We haven't actually had much time about the role of the media, the role that you incarnate every day of bringing back into the conversation the witness to all of this and making the witness credible. So we've spoken of a deficit of trust, we've spoken of a lack of faith in systems, processes, but in the design of the democratic model, that lies to a large extent with the media. Mm-hmm. And yet I would say we've moved from mental commons to echo chambers. And I'm not confident about of the path to get us out.
Don't answer that. Eric Schwartz, use the mic.
Okay, I've got a short question. I'm afraid it's almost like an essay question because so many of your answers have made me think about the Ohio Senate race, Tim Ryan and J.D. Vance.
Yeah.
So can you just reflect on how that race is indicative of so much of what you've been talking about.
Yeah, really interesting. All right, so in 15 seconds, I would say, in addition to media in the part that I inhabit, I would add social media, of course. It was implied. But that is, so one of the themes that runs through Wildland that is really core to how I've come to understand this period is that we took these things that have operated for a long time. There have been conspiracy theorists and lunatic ideas operating in little tiny ways all over the place. And then we created these devices, these instruments, in the same way that we created an instrument that can shoot bullets at a rate that nobody ever envisioned when they conceived of the Constitution and the Second Amendment. We've created essentially information bullets that can be shot like Facebook, and it's very similar. And same thing in political technology. So we are kind of living in this era in which the tools are way more powerful than we know what to do with, and more importantly, the proprietors do not care. And I think when I started on this, the Rupert Murdochs, the Lachlan Murdochs, the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world did not believe that they had to care. They didn't think there was any political consequence for what they do, and they didn't think there was any market consequence. They didn't think users care. If you want a reason for optimism, I'm not ready to go that far, but ask anybody under 30 if they use Facebook, and the answer in the United States is no. But what they do use is TikTok and everything else. But they are at least beginning to become a little bit more aware of the poison that it is when they consume it in a way that, frankly, my generation was not when we started using it. One last thing on that, just because it's a subject of great interest to me. Fact-checking has become a status symbol in the United States. Places like the New Yorker magazine, which is a teensy tiny little piece of the American media landscape, people come to places now that do fact-checking because it's considered something that is valuable. And 5 or 6 years ago, nobody even thought that it mattered. So calling it a thing helps. The Ohio race is this kind of X-ray of the American political crisis. You've got J.D. Vance, who people will remember came to prominence in the United States because he generated a fantasy of what it meant to be an Appalachian success story. He's reviled in Appalachia because the story that he told was, if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, everything's going to be great. Stop whining and you'll make it. And that is an offensive idea to people who have been living under generations of political abuse, of lobbying against reasonable provision of public services. And he couldn't win in West Virginia, but he might be able to win in Ohio. Tim Ryan is somebody who actually is closer to that Katie Lauer figure I was talking about. Tim Ryan is sometimes running against his own party. He's actually proven to be much more popular than people thought. He's walking a very fine line. But he is somebody, to go to the earlier question, who recognized that if you want to try to get a Democrat into office in the state of Ohio, you don't necessarily get to run the campaign you want in your deepest of hearts. You run the campaign that you think will win, and at that point, then you can begin to get some of these policy objectives accomplished.
Okay. Fabulous talk, fabulous event. Read the book. Judge for yourself about the optimism-pessimism issue, and let's all hope that Evan is right. And you can augment your sense of where we're all going. Tomorrow at 1700 Central European Time, we will be doing a Zoom on the midterm elections with Doug Sosnick, former political director in the Clinton White House and someone who was consulted by 50 senators and governors, CEOs, universities, foundations, you name it. And again, that will be at 5 o'clock, 1700 tomorrow, Berlin time. I hope you will join us. And mostly, I hope right now you'll give a big hand to Evan Osnos. I almost said Evan Thomas.